Right, hello. I'm Richard Smith, and I'm the chair of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, which I fear quite a lot of you will not have heard of, even though the Intensive Care Society and the Royal Society of Medicine are members. We've been going about 8 years. We have about 25 organisations in membership, most of the Royal Colleges, the physicians, surgeons, GPs, the nurses, and altogether we have about 900,000 people who are members of our members. And we are about mitigating the effects of climate change and encouraging adaptation and promoting the benefits to health. So today we're going to be discussing how do you influence policymakers, and it comes after the previous webinars that have had a lot of great stuff in them and that you can watch on recording. So I'm going to introduce our guests one at a time, and they're each going to speak for just a few minutes. Then we'll have discussion, and if you want to ask questions, put it in the chat, because we're going to have mostly, this is going to be discussion. We don't quite know where it's going to go, but I'm confident it'll go somewhere interesting and exciting. So I'm going to ask each of our speakers to say for a few minutes to talk about how they feel policy and decision makers should and could be influenced, and then give examples of approaches they've used and discuss any other ideas they have. And first we're going to have Jojo Mehta, who is co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International. So Jojo, over to you.
Hi, thank you, and great to be in front of this slightly different audience to my usual. It's always good to broaden horizons in terms of who has heard of what we're doing. Our campaign focuses specifically on criminalising destruction of nature at the highest level, so at the International Criminal Court, making ecocide a crime alongside genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. And so, in a way, one of the most obvious responses to Richard's question is to say that our approach for influencing policymakers is a structural one, is looking at the not sort of, encouraging them to play the game better potentially, which is what we feel many also very hugely useful climate solutions do, but actually looking at the rules of that game and how it's played. And so criminal law has a very specific role in that, in the sense that there's a possibility of creating an enforceable deterrent for decision makers at the top level, but also it's hugely sort of morally and symbolically important as well, criminal law in particular, in the sense that our sort of globally dominant legal paradigm we use criminal law to draw moral lines, or to help to draw moral lines. And so criminalizing destruction of nature at the highest level as an international crime sends a very strong message, which is currently something of a missing piece in the climate and ecological crisis, in the sense that, with human rights and social justice, at least one knows that mass murder and torture are beyond the pale. In the environmental world, there's a little bit of a sense of operating on a void, in that kind of sense of having a really foundational piece that this much damage is simply not acceptable. So we aim to influence, obviously via a legal perspective, in terms of actually, if you like, kind of recruiting political support for this. We've been working on this for a number of years, but it's only really in the last couple of years that this discourse around ecocide has grown to the extent that it has, and has now picked up very strong political momentum. And we would actually put that down to a combination of things, only one of which is probably directly in our hands, which is being very specific about a very almost surgically precise aim for a very long time, in a certain amount of depth. So being very, very specialized and loud about it, particularly given the word itself, ecocide, has a kind of internal momentum. Once people kind of grasp this concept that, here's a word that encapsulates serious harm to nature that may be happening in many different areas, and we can all see those areas, bringing that together is quite a powerful thing to do in one word. And it also tends to sort of provoke, if you like, a natural intuitive reaction. Oh, that shouldn't be happening, that needs to be stopped. So that in itself is powerful. But we would also say that it's been helped very much over the last couple of years. And it's always a bit strange saying helped, because of course the worse things get in the world, in terms of the more apocalyptic events unfold in real time, the more people listen to us. So that's always a bit of a bittersweet sort of thing going on there for us. But obviously recent reports, sort of international reports, the IPCC reports and so on have highlighted the extent of the damage and the situation that we find ourselves in, but also climate mobilizations on the ground have also made a huge difference. So the school strikes inspired by Greta, the Extinction Rebellion actions, Sunrise Movement and others like it, in the sense that what that's done is it's opened up a conversation in the media and in the political conversation, in the political discussion around climate, that's sort of brought it more front and center. It's kind of pushed the Overton window open, if you like, and it's allowed what we've been saying for many years to actually land in that space. And as my dear departed friend and colleague, the barrister and lawyer Polly Higgins used to say, I love Extinction Rebellion. They make us look moderate. And so I'm sure Chris will have something to say about that. But yeah, so that's a kind of a very brief overview, and obviously very much looking forward to further discussion.
So Jojo, can I just ask, oddly enough, I heard a discussion this morning on the radio about the International Criminal Court, and they pointed out that the US, China, Russia, Israel don't belong, and that maybe it's a means for jumping on the weak and the powerful get away with it. Is that a problem?
It's an interesting one. It's true that not all countries are members of the ICC. However, I think people often don't realise how broad the remit of the ICC actually can be, in the sense that a perpetrator from those countries can be prosecuted by the ICC if either the person in their nationality comes from a member state, even if they're operating for a player that's in, for example, the US, or if the results are happening in a member state, or if even they have an operational office in a member state that's ratified the crime, or, you know, in the sense that somebody can be moving through, like General Pinochet was at the end of the 90s in the UK, and was arrested here for a law that Chile wasn't signed up to, but which the UK Supreme Court judged that effectively could be prosecuted in the UK. So there are broader perspectives. Of course, the other side of that is that if the US and China and so on aren't members of the ICC, they also can't prevent this law going through, and they can't prevent the sort of gradual marginalization and sort of symbolic effect. And then one final point would be that with Ecocide, you have a slightly different situation to the other crimes, in the sense that, you know, people have, you know, accused the ICC of being, you know, yet another colonial institution, you know, prosecuting African warlords and effectively, you know, those in the wealthy north get away with what they do. But with Ecocide, you have a slightly different scenario, because often the effects and the ecocides themselves are taking place in the global south often, but the decisions that lead to those situations are taking place in the wealthy north. And it's those decision makers who are actually targeted by this crime, because the way the ICC works is it goes sort of up the hierarchy to effectively the highest possible point in terms of that decision making. So it does actually also offer a little bit of a possibility for a rebalance there as well.
Good, thank you, Jojo. So I hope now we're going to hear from Mary. You're there, Mary, are you? We can't see you and you're on mute, but I hope you're still there. If not, we'll go to somebody else. So Mary seems to have gone away again. So let's hear now from Mike Childs, who's Head of Science, Policy and Research for the Friends of the Earth. So the same questions, Mike.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much for the invite as well. I'm quite long in the tooth. I've been a campaigner for 30 years now. So there's kind of lots of experience to draw from in many ways. But from a Friends of the Earth kind of perspective, one of our most successful campaigns was our Big Ask campaign, which was the campaign for the Climate Change Act, which clearly is kind of shaping to a large degree policy decisions made by government over a number of years. So we launched that we came up with the idea in 2004, and we launched it then, and then effectively we led a grassroots campaign for that law to get passed, because we do live, as we know, in a parliamentary democracy with constituents, and while often the case, people think their MPs don't listen, and that is the case in some circumstances. Actually, if enough ordinary people get to their MP and talk about the issue, then they will listen. You know, there'll always be a handful that won't, but most of them will listen. And what we were calling for was a law. We had clear evidence that, you know, climate change was real. People had understood that it was real and it was out there, it needed action. And we had very clear evidence that the UK government at the time had made lots of promises to reduce emissions, but weren't delivering on those promises. It was a Labour government at the time. And the idea of a climate change law was initially really strongly resisted by the Labour government. They said, we don't need a law, we've got commitments, we've put policy in place. But through that grassroots campaigning and with constituents lobbying their MPs, we were beginning to build up kind of a groundswell of MP support for that. We worked out as a kind of rule of thumb that each MP needed to be contacted by about 200 constituents, and then suddenly you'd see them flip from not necessarily being oppositional, but being silent on it, to declaring their support for it. And we organised not just kind of postcards at that time, because we didn't have the kind of collectivism we've got now. I suspect that number of 200 would need to be much bigger in a kind of collectivist world. But we, as well as people signing postcards to get delivered, we also organised and helped and facilitated Friends of the Earth members and others to go and visit their MP face to face and back those up. And through that route, MP could see that actually this is a reasonable thing to be asking for. I can see my constituents care about it. So that worked. One of the reasons I think it worked, which is a kind of challenge, it's a bit of a double-edged sword in some ways, is the demand was very reasonable. We were calling for a law that said the UK had to reduce its emissions by at least 3% every year, which back in 2004 was a kind of steady pathway to where we needed to get. Clearly, things have changed, the science has updated, the scale of the rate of emissions reduction is faster now. So that sounded all very plausible and possible, and we got lots of political support from across the benches, and ultimately that led the Labour government to then flip and say, actually, we do think this is a good idea. As well. I think we're in such a state on climate change now and nature loss that in some ways the things that need to happen are much more radical than they were at that time. So it could be seen to be unreasonable, but I still think we can talk about these things in a reasonable way and bring people on board with us, but it does take that conversation. A few other things briefly about the campaign. One, it was so I'm not the best judge of this, but I'm told it was quite aspirational and cool, and I haven't been aspirational and cool for 40 years, so I'm not the best judge of it, as I say. But actually, we had really good creatives around it. Tom York from Radiohead signed up to the campaign. We organised gigs in Leeds and Manchester and other places around the country where young people feel was safe spaces and their kind of space where they could support it. So it did have that kind of aspirational, what I want to be part of this feel as well. But mostly, and I think that's a lesson for all of us as campaigners, and I'm sure we all know this, it takes graft and it takes time. And we ran that campaign for 4 years till the Climate Change Act was passed. And we knew even if passing that act alone wasn't enough, that we had to make sure that we were campaigning as hard as we can to make sure it's implemented, which we're still doing. You'd have seen the news around heat pumps and heat building strategy today, completely inadequate. We're still needing to do that campaigning. So one of I think my lessons from being a long in the tooth old time campaigner is, this is a long business, and I know time is running out, but we've got to stick at it and keep motivated and look for those wins on the way, because actually, we've got the moral case behind us, we've got the evidence case behind us. We will win this, but it will take hard perseverance, and we need to bring as many people on board of that as possible. It can't just be the kind of usual suspects campaigning for this. We need to make it something that everybody can participate in, and that does mean we need to think about our tactics and our language as well as we do that. And thinking about these, sorry, just very briefly, Rich, the other components of it as well, because of course acting on climate change is vitally important for the climate and for future generations and those on the front line, particularly in developing countries, but also here in the UK. But actually there's so many co-benefits, and that can be a route for bringing people in. So, the shocking murder of David Amess last week, he was a Conservative MP, not necessarily obviously seen as a Green, but he campaigned long and hard with Friends of the Earth to pass legislation on fuel poverty. Not so much because of the climate change impacts, and he was never a climate skeptic, but because he could see the sense in terms of looking after people's well-being and doing something for the environment as well. So sometimes it's those co-benefits we need to talk about as strongly as the issue itself. I think we should always talk about the issue, but we should talk about the co-benefits as well.
Thanks very much, Mike. A very quick question. I was interested in that magic number of 200 per MP. Does it need to be sort of 200 different letters as opposed to 200 postcards the same?
Well, as I say, times have changed, Rich, aren't they? So, I think 200, I'm sure Mary can speak to this more than me, the number of emails you need to send or the petition you need to send. I think that my sense is that the Member of Parliament, actually Mary is much better to answer this, they've got a sense this is a genuine concern from a large number of constituents in their area, and that will enable that to break through the vast quantity of communications that MPs get. But perhaps Mary is probably better to answer that than me.
Right, and maybe the more marginal their seat, the more they pay attention. So good. So you sort of half introduced Mary. I don't know whether you heard the very beginning, Mary. We're asking each speaker to say a little bit about how they think policy and decision makers should and could be influenced, and perhaps to give an example of an approach that succeeded. And I was thinking, as I was listening to Mike, we might also ask later about ones that haven't worked, because you can learn from failure as well as from success. So Mary is a former Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, so she's been bombarded by all these emails and letters, Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and she now runs Mary Cray Advisory. And I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
Did a great job there. Thanks very much, Richard. Well, first of all, I just want to start by saying we had it brought home to us yet again this weekend, just the price that politicians pay for standing up, being public servants and participating in democracy. And David was a very twinkly, spry friend to everybody in Parliament. And it was really devastating to hear about his cruel murder on Friday, and brought back memories of the loss of Joe Cox, who was my neighbour up in Batley and Spen. So let's start by, politicians have a lot of things going on in their heads, right? Don't expect them to be interested in your stuff. That's the first thing. So just because you're obsessed and passionate and enthusiastic and 100% committed to whatever your cause is, doesn't mean that, Tory backbencher, Labour backbencher, SNP backbencher number 43 is going to be interested. So you have to start with an argument. And I think you have 5 different ways of getting into politicians. The first one is everyone's a constituent. So you write to your local MP, and the David Amess example on fuel poverty was about people coming to his surgery, him listening as a good constituency MP and making the changes that he wanted to see and bringing those problems to a national stage. In my case, I had somebody who was who'd suffered catastrophic burn injuries. I met with medics at my hospital. They said, there's no law that says you have to put a thermostat on a bath. This is crazy. We did the Hot Water Burns Like Fire campaign. And after 4 long years of campaigning, enlisting the help of celebrities, we finally got that change to the building regulations passed. So there are different things. I can talk about how to make your campaign sexy, but my most successful photo op was inviting Amanda Redman of New Tricks fame into the House of Commons. She too had suffered a catastrophic burn injury, and I sent a note out to all MPs and said, Amanda Redman will be here, come and show your support for the campaign. And there was a very orderly queue of middle-aged men winding around the inside of Portcullis House. It's like, this has been a marvellous success, mostly because they wanted to touch Amanda Redman's hand and shake her hand. So if you can get somebody, I was like, oh, I didn't know, Amanda's reached parts that I can't reach. So find a campaigning politician that will do the work for you, and their office will take you a long way. Second is, you're all professionals. And as medics, you are revered. You're there when we begin our lives, you're there at the end of our lives. You have a really privileged place. So if I think about a really successful campaign that was run by professionals, the judges and the firefighters took the government to court over changes to their final salary pension schemes and said the transitional reliefs were discriminatory. The High Court said yes. And now millions of public sector people who are paid by public sector employers are going to benefit from the McLeod judgment remedies. And that's just deciding that we're going to sue the government. We can demonstrate injustice. So if you have a legal case and you're well funded, then definitely, court is a good route. I talked about your role as medics, but I also think the NHS has a huge carbon footprint. If it was a country, it would be the 37th biggest country in the world. And now post-COVID, it's probably the 30, it's even bigger. And there's a sustainable development unit in the NHS. And as far as I'm aware, it missed its net zero interim targets for 2020. Because when I was chairing the Environmental Audit Committee, I kept inviting them in. I kept saying, how are you doing on the way? And I could never get a straight answer from the SDC. So you are part of and effectively a country. You are in that country. You are one of the 1.2 million people that work in that country. So why aren't you petitioning that country, the NHS, the Sustainable Development Unit, what's your plan? What's the 5-year plan for the NHS? There is one. So, as activists internally, you have a hugely important role to play. Most of you are academics, fairly intelligent, I would say, thought leaders, let's hope. And you have a role to play there on forging networks, on coming out with the science. I think there's some lessons from COVID for us here about how scientists speak to politicians, how they speak to the public. And I think there's some real weaknesses in messages on COVID and in messages on climate. And I'm really interested in that. And the final thing is we're all consumers. We all buy clothes. We all buy food and we all buy pensions. And your kind of carbon shadow, it's not your footprint, it's not the direct emissions, you've got rid of your car, you've got your solar panels, whatever it is. It's about how do you make your pension investments climate neutral and nature neutral. And I think there are sort of 3 or 4 lessons from COVID for us all here as campaigners. The first is listen to the scientists, but the scientists have also got to learn to speak up, and they've got to learn how to speak complex truths to people with limited time and understanding. The second thing is, in the same way that COVID was sexist and hit more men than women, climate change is going to be sexist, it's going to be racist, and it's going to be ageist. So COVID hit the old and it hit people from BAME communities. Climate is going to hit the young, our young, and it's going to hit the poor. And it'll be sexist because more women are affected than men. So in the heat wave in Paris, I can't remember what it was now, but there was a big heat wave in Paris, and the people who died was widows, essentially single women, in August in Paris, living in attics, who were unable to open their windows or leave their buildings, and they just overheated and died. And there was a real sort of gender disparity there. I think the third big lesson from COVID for the climate is that massive behaviour change is possible, and at scale and at speed. So I think there's reasons for huge optimism here, and you need really strong leadership on this. I think also COVID has shown it's the end of indifference. So we can't just be indifferent to these things. We're all in it. We are literally all in it together. And when we had our lockdown, it was like, well, the fact that I'm not an old man with breathing difficulties, that doesn't butter any parsnips. I've got to stay at home. My kids have got to stay at home, because we have a sort of social risk and a systemic risk to the NHS. And the final thing I would say is there's no vaccine or treatment or herd immunity for climate change. So, we cannot have a choice if we've got a monopoly supplier. We can't, I know Jeff Bezos wants us all to go and live on the moon, but it's just a billionaire's fantasy. So planet Earth is our monopoly supplier of everything we need to exist. And I think those 5 ways that I've outlined about, as constituents, as professionals, as participants in the NHS, as academics, and as consumers, you have 5 different ways in to demanding the change that we all want to see. And I'm happy to share any further thoughts on that with you.
That was brilliant, Mary. Thank you very much. Very practical. So actually, we've had a lot of really practical stuff. I just wanted to update you on the SDU because it's now been replaced by the greener NHS programme. And they redid the carbon footprint of the NHS, and they published their annual results just a couple of weeks ago, and they are on target after 1 year. And, to give the NHS in England its credit, it's the only health system in the world that has a coherent plan for getting to net zero. And it's certainly somewhere that we've concentrated a lot of energy. So I'm the chair of the UK Health Alliance, and the current Chief Sustainability Officer for the NHS was the first director of the Alliance. So.
Right.
So now we're going to hear from Chris, who's been arrested no end of times. I don't know whether you've actually done a spell in prison, Chris, but Chris is the co-founder of Doctors for XR and a GP.
Hi, Richard. Thanks to all the great speakers so far. So yes, I'm a GP, arrested twice, Richard, not no end of times, convicted once. So I am technically, I do have a criminal record, but thankfully it hasn't impacted my freedom so far. So yeah, I co-founded Doctors for Extinction Rebellion in 2019, which despite the name includes nurses, midwives, paramedics, and other associated health professionals. And we've had a lot of public support from some very senior people, such as the WHO director, Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Lancet editor Richard Horton. As to the question about how to influence policymakers, so clearly lots of strategies are necessary. We like to think of people being kind of inside the system, such as Mary and lots of the people who've been speaking so far, and also outside the system. And these are people like myself, Extinction Rebellion, and the new group Insulate Britain, who I have no affiliation with, but just mentioning them. And our belief is that the fastest way to change policies is basically through popular culture, because policy tends to follow popular culture. Everyone in the NHS who's working on this has been educated by popular culture, whether you read The Guardian, the Daily Mail, or get your news from Facebook. That's why we've come to this position. Sadly, the NHS hasn't so far made the bold move to educate staffing, doctors, nurses, and other professionals. Although it is pushing education for students, we haven't got the time to wait for them to get into positions of power. So, so that's what we believe. So unless you can alter news stories and get influencers to speak up, I think it's going to be impossible to move as quickly as the science dictates. And we do that through protest, which has to be creative and has to be clear to allow journalists to write about it in a coherent way so that its readers can learn about it, essentially. So in terms of things that have been successful, I think protest is a more difficult one because it's a kind of success to me is if we get into publications. It means that we're affecting the narrative. And also we tend to see after protests that we get quite a lot of emails into our inbox from all sorts of health professionals saying, hi, we saw what you did. We saw that you got a write-up in The Guardian or The Independent or The Times, and we want to join as well. So that's kind of a metric, as it were, of our success to date. We are changing our tactics a little bit. So currently we have a campaign against JP Chase, who are the world's biggest financier of fossil fuels. I believe it's $317 billion since the Paris Agreement. And there's lots of reasons why we target them. That's the first one. They're the biggest financier. They also use an outdated 2070 net zero model to direct their investments. They don't make that clear, but we've been through a lot of their documents. I was there yesterday outside their Canary Wharf headquarters with my colleague Maggie, who's a nurse. And we sat there for about 3 hours outside their building with a few A2 posters. We had a lot of engagement, actually, and a few people who were insiders took our leaflets into the buildings. One of them said he would take it to a meeting he was about to go to and use that as like an icebreaker to start that conversation. And that's kind of how I think of our group, really. It is an icebreaker. It creates a window of opportunity for others who are inside the system to do the work that they want to do, but sometimes the nowism, like we're always dealing with current stuff and not the future, gets in the way. So absolutely, I agree with a lot of what's been said. Mike spoke about looking for the wins. So we think that specificity is probably going to be important to us going forward, because the press has been full of generic climate change activism for a few years now. People are getting a bit tired, I think, of reading this. So it does need a different narrative. So we're trying to move with the times and do something more effective. And yeah, a lot of people are also because it's now created a network. We've got over 1,000 people who've emailed us over the last 2 years, and we're putting people together with people who are maybe their neighbours in a hospital or in their constituency, so that they can join forces together and use their collective advocacy in hospital level, at trust level, and with local politicians.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Are you saying that your strategy is now to be sort of less disruptive and not to aim to get arrested as you did?
Not necessarily. Just currently, we felt that rather than going and doing protest against the government, we felt that choosing one of the worst actors was perhaps a better way to create change. JP Morgan are a huge organization with offices all over the world, and we actually are calling on other health and climate groups all over the world to join us. You don't need to be arrested. We just sat outside their headquarters with some signs. We believe that if we can do that in enough places, we will create a narrative. If JP Morgan refuse to engage, it may be that in the future we do something more disruptive at their headquarters. That hasn't been decided, but it will basically depend on what happens. But we're prepared to do that if, as an escalation strategy. Like, I think all these things need an escalation strategy. We can't stop at a letter. If it doesn't work, you have to move forward, just like you would do in an intensive care situation or with a crushing patient.
Good. Thanks a lot, Chris. So now we're going to hear from Anya Goepfert, who's a public health registrar, and she's the Climate and Health Committee representative of the Faculty of Public Health, and she's also from Health Declares a Climate Emergency. Anya.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to talk very briefly about operating within a slightly different political context. So public health sits in local authorities and interacts regularly and often with locally elected councillors. And we are often, not always, civil servants, which puts a different level of kind of restriction on how you can speak out. But I think there are a lot of overlaps potentially for people working within the NHS who maybe feel more comfortable or more able currently to work within the system. And that's also where my role in the organisation Health Declares a Climate Emergency plays a role. So Health Declares a Climate Emergency is essentially a network of groups. We are a range of healthcare professionals working in all specialties and kind of all multidisciplinary roles within the NHS. And we've kind of got groups that work locally, so people get together in kind of specific geographical locations to work together to campaign for change within their hospital or their setting, or specialty specific groups, so people working, for example, within a Royal College or within a kind of particular national body. So in terms of working in that context, I think there are really important things to explore. One is really honestly identifying with yourself where your most power lies and which people you have the most power to influence, because if you think carefully about that, you not only use your resources carefully, but you direct your campaigning quite effectively. And just to give you one example of an organisation that I won't name that I've worked for in the past, they presented their new strategy at a meeting, and it didn't contain anything about, this was a public health organisation, didn't contain anything about climate change and health. So I had already been pondering for a long time how this organisation should and could tackle climate and health emergency, and had a plan in my head for kind of, this is the organisation, these are the various components within it, and they can all work on these particular areas of expertise to make progress. So I went up to the CEO at the end and said, I just wondered whether you'd thought about what the role of this organisation is in the climate emergency. And she kind of paused and said, well, I have thought about it. It's at the back of my head. And then she said, well, actually, it's really at the front of my head, but I just don't know what we can do. And I basically had a preformed plan and said, well, here's my kind of top 5 ideas about what you can do. And she said, great, can you go away and make those happen? And what this really taught me was it's really important to ask people and to basically mention the thing that's missing, because most people these days will have thought about climate change and will have thought, what's my role in this? And the second thing is, it's really important to have that plan ready. So not to wait for permission to develop a plan, but to at least have some ideas about what the changes that you want to see, because that way they really kind of see what you mean and can be given a bit of direction about where you might go to. So those are a couple of my kind of top tips for maybe engaging with people. And just to add one more thing is that connecting with others, whoever they may be, whoever you feel most kind of in tune with to work with together on this issue, is really powerful. It can be quite lonely if you're working on your own, but working in a team or in a pair with a couple of like-minded people, and now that we have all sorts of online setups as well, if you kind of are geographically isolated and there's no one around you, there's lots of people you can connect with for support. So I'd highly recommend tapping into some form of network to give you basically colleagues and a team to work with on this.
Thanks, Anya. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Where can you really make a difference? Where have you got power that can be useful? Because you could say that the people we really need to affect are the Chinese government, the US government. You know, they're the people who are going to determine how far we're going to succeed. But of course, you know, how much can we influence those people? Whereas there are people much closer to us, like the NHS, that we can potentially influence. Good. So final speaker before we begin our discussion, we're going to hear from Trizzha Feliciano from Greenpeace. She's a medical student at UCL, and one of the things they've done is produce the Planetary Health Report card. She's the partnerships and recruitment chair of that, and that I think was a big success. So Trizzha, over to you.
Hello. So I'm going to keep this short just because of all of the stuff that you have already said, which is wonderful to hear. And I'm excited to get to the discussion parts of this day. So in my opinion, to achieve the rapid and far-reaching change required to protect the health of future generations, we need steadfast and unanimous political will. And the key to achieving this, as many of you have already said, is public support. So change is rooted in this public support, and without this convincing companies and governments to even consider expensive and tough decisions necessary to protect our natural environment is extremely difficult. And Greenpeace tries to do this in very many ways. Most well known is probably by our NVDA activists, so our non-violent direct action activists, are brilliant when it comes to highlighting issues to very many people through attracting the press. But there's also my role as a Greenpeace speaker, giving talks to be it schools, companies and community groups, which helps raise awareness of the environmental issues that we face today and can help encourage and empower people to make a difference. Now, people in healthcare are in what I believe is an important and unique position in the public eye. If those in healthcare are united in believing climate change is the biggest issue on the table, I believe the public can soon follow, and then it's just a matter of helping policy and decision makers find and implement the solutions that we so desperately need. And we've seen through the pandemic, surely the inspirational things that we've done, we've banded together globally and locally and nationally. And this is what we need to happen ever so desperately for the climate crisis. And we can do it. We've seen the changes that have happened. We've seen the rapid things that we've done together to band together to help save so many different people. And so it is possible. A lot of people think that things are going to take too long to do or maybe too hard to do, but there is some sort of magic when we can unite together in a single rooted cause. So I'm going to stop there. That's my little.
Good. Well, thanks a lot, Trizzha. So actually, you raise a question in my mind that we could maybe begin the discussion with. And I think the way we'll do this, not everybody has to say everything on every subject, or we'll only discuss two things. So maybe you could indicate to me if you want to speak by kind of waving your hand or whatever. But Trizzha, you made me think, you talked about the potential power and trust, and Mary referred to it too, that we as health professionals have. But the reality is, we've not been very prominent in this debate up until now. I mean, none of the previous 25 COPs have had health featured in it. It's going to be a small part of this one. So why haven't we done better as health professionals, and how could we do better?
Am I answering this or?
Well, if you want to, I was going to have thrown it open, but if you start, have a go. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Okay, so it's quite hard as medical professionals because there's so much time that we're already got a lot of things on our mind, protecting patient safety and making sure that they're utmost with trying to safeguard them and their illnesses. And it's quite hard, I think, to think what else can doctors do? And there's also the things with the NHS. It feels a bit hypocritical sometimes to try and change your personal life and be a bit more eco-friendly than you go into the work environment, and you're wasting so much stuff in there, and it's quite hard. And I think sometimes medical professionals really enjoy that trust and trying to convince the public as well. You feel a bit sort of anxious and cautious about trying to do that, because maybe you feel like maybe that they won't take it in a good way. But I think one thing to think about is that people, when they think of climate change, they don't really think about it affecting them. And this is the reason why we really should be utilizing this. They think that it's not really their problem right now, it's going to be affecting future generations. And when you tell them and raise awareness of this, that it's going to be affecting globally everybody's health, it really is impactful, and it can really be something as a talking point as medical professionals to them. So I think that's what I'll say about that.
I mean, just to go further with this discussion, I mean, I've got a graph that I use often that comes from the Lancet Countdown that shows the carbon footprint of health systems, and they're almost all going up. And there's really something crazy about that when this is the major threat to health in the world today. And in the US, it's 12% of the carbon footprint of the US, which is a massive footprint. I mean, it's not surprising because it's something like 20% of the economy. So how could we as health professionals do better? Chris?
I just wanted to add to that. I think there is this kind of almost double think, like because we're so focused on individual care most of our lives. You know, we've got the individual in front of us. We want to save their lives and improve it. And then at the same time, there's this huge thing that's growing every year that because we're not tackling it, and we know, all of us, that it's going to impact on the total of health far more than anything we could do as individuals. And a lot of health professionals have come to us because they feel bad. They feel really sad that they're doing this little thing here. And yes, it's very valuable to reduce suffering on an individual level, but they can't square the two things together. They know that they can have probably more of an effect if they do work with groups like Extinction Rebellion, who are trying to get it into the press to change the culture, to change the politicians. So it's really very difficult. Yeah, but that's why I joined anyway.
Jojo, did you want to add something, and then I'll ask Mary?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things there. One is that I think there is this strong sense of disempowerment for a lot of people that has actually been, I would say, sort of exacerbated by the kind of corporate PR machine over the last 20 years or so, where, you know, effectively individuals are made to feel that they are personally somehow responsible for climate change, collectively as individuals. Now, of course, that is true to a certain extent. And of course, it's absolutely important that we all get much more conscious about what we do, what we use, and, you know, by extension, that our systems do, including our health systems. But there is also something that's not really being said there, which is that, you know, we're not just consumers. Yes, we are consumers, as Mary says, you're right, but we're not just consumers, we're citizens, and we're given options. And the options that we're given are decided often at the highest level, at the level of policy, at the level of people at the top of industry, often that have rather intimate, perhaps sometimes unhealthily intimate relationships with those who are in those positions of power. And so, for example, I mean, I live in a rural area, I have kids that need to get places, I drive a car. Now, I drive a fossil fuel car, not because I want to drive a fossil fuel car, but because I can't afford anything else. I've never been able to afford more than a few £100 on a car in my life. And so, effectively, and that option that's available to me is not my consumer demand. It's got nothing to do with me saying I want this thing and therefore, fossil fuel companies are producing it. It's to do with, what is made available to me. I mean, that's just one example. But I think the other thing that we're looking at here is a major mindset issue, and that's not any individual person's fault. We have a mindset in the West where that's developed over many hundreds of years, where we have this very strong separation from nature. We don't tend to think of ourselves as deeply interdependent with the natural world, but of course we are. Everything we breathe, eat, drink, everything we do is provided by our home, our planet, and those ecosystems being healthy has an absolute direct effect, not just in terms of climate change, but for decades already in terms of just destruction of ecosystems and habitat loss and so many other things. But because we tend to think of ourselves as separate, we tend, we're kind of people islands in a way, and our health systems are built on top of that. And of course it's very real. Human suffering is absolutely fundamental to us, but we don't yet extend that sort of sphere of sympathy or compassion or whatever it is, to the natural world. And it's actually becoming imperative that we do that. And that's one of the things that, that we think that aiming for a highest level criminal law has the potential to sort of start to trigger, because once you actually say at the highest level, destroying people is bad and destroying the environment to this extent is also really bad, you're actually not just saying this thing is unlawful, but you're saying it's bad and wrong. You're potentially starting to create almost a new taboo that's really, really needed, actually. And that has a little bit of potential to potentially start connecting those dots, which is, I think, something that more and more people are doing. But I think we are, we're having to do that against a very long history of treating nature as a bank of resources rather than as something we're utterly dependent on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mary, and maybe, in some ways, this question of how can we as health professionals or intensive care doctors have more impact is a sort of key central question. So maybe Mike and Anya, I'll get you to say something about it as well after we've heard from Mary. But Mary, how can we as health professionals have more influence? How can we get you to listen to us?
Well, I would go back and say, how can you as a profession listen to the voices of the young, and the voices of women, and the voices of minorities? Because it's about power structure, and it's about who gets heard, and it's about what topics are selected at conferences, and what topics go into journals, and what topics are you get your professorship with. And if it's not part of the day job, it doesn't tend to get rewarded. So there's nothing in it for people professionally. They just look awkward. So I think there's something there about power structures, and I don't think this is unique to the NHS. I think it's in every organisation. The people at the top are kind of like told what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear, and no one ever gets thanked for being a whistleblower. No one, people get sacked in the NHS for whistleblowing, and so people look around. There's a fear of being the first mover. You look at the trick on telly last night about a climate scientist who was whose research was distorted. The sort of forces that are out there that want status quo will find ways to ridicule you, to make your life uncomfortable, to get you trolled now on social media. So no one wants to put their head above the parapet and get it sort of knocked off. I think the second thing is, if you're going to have a truly resource efficient economy, I had this when my husband broke his leg. I'm like, okay, so where do we take the crutches back to? And they're like, no, you throw the crutches away. And I was just like, what? Like, everyone gets a pair of crutches when they break their leg and then you throw them away at the tip. And it's like, yeah, it's infection control. And it's like, that's bullshit. That's because you just can't be asked to take them back in, put them in a steam room, disinfect them, and give them out again. Someone's just made a decision. You're the Amazon of our country. Just chuck it away in a hole. We don't care. It's just too hard. Everyone keep looking at all the nice, shiny, life-saving work over here. And, the long tail of waste and incineration will ignore. I worked with some doctors in Wakefield. They had this great thing, which was taking pacemakers out of dead people and implanting them in India. And I was like, first of all, I was like, you do what? You do what? You take pacemakers out of dead people and then you clean them up and you put them in a box and you take them to India. And it's like, yeah, they're really expensive in India and people can't afford them. We give people an extra sort of, I don't know, 10 years of life. And I was like, okay, but if you can do it for India, why can't you do it? It's like, oh, you know, rules, regulations, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like, well, you know, there's all sorts of arguments here, but you're into the ethics and you're into the, you know, if you really, are you going to really have that argument? And what's the ick factor? You know, we're cool about other people's clothes. We're not cool about other people's pacemakers or crutches. And so I think it's there. I was lucky enough to get a new hospital in Wakefield after 5 years of lobbying. And, you know, the design of that hospital was, we'll put the nursery right next to the road so that it's nice and handy for people to come in and pick up and drop off. And it's like, you're putting children next to the biggest source of air pollution. You know, the hospital, the car park, is privileged over the children because people want to walk nice and close to work. So the parents' need to have a 30-second walk to work was privileged over the children's need for clean air, and just things like that in the design of it. I was just like, this is crazy. So I think, and, you know, I sat with the architects, I sat with the commissioners, and they're like, yeah, but we've done the plans now. And it's all just too hard. So those are some specific things where I think, you know, I put them out there. I think people are afraid. I think it's not the day job. I think you have a ton of policy change coming at you all the time from politicians, you know, the latest NHS reorganisation, the latest QOF outcomes, the latest framework. And, you know, Chris, hats off to you. You know, you said, you know, you're still a GP despite your criminal record. It's like, 6 years of medical school. Lots of people don't have that level of courage. And I think we all need to sort of reach in, you know, and find that, you know, that level of courage. Not everybody has to do JP Morgan and get arrested. And there are, you know, there are arguments against the direct action route. But I do think that you need creativity, you need to partnership across different networks. Anya's thing about public health people, it's classic. It's like, oh, you know, we don't have any buses, but no one wants to get out of their car. And, you know, even as GPs, if you say, could you walk to your next appointment, please? You know, and because we're trying to get everyone who lives within a mile to walk to the appointment, people would do it if you asked them. They won't do it if you don't ask them and you don't tell. So sometimes you just need to ask and think about little micro prompts that get people thinking, oh, I can walk it, and it'd be good for you, Mrs. Miggins, and that level. Sometimes you just need to encourage folks as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I mean, one thing I would say is that the sense of waste that runs around in the health service is something that does get people's attention. A lot of surgeons, that's the first thing they mention if you talk about, you know, all this stuff that we're throwing away all the time. So Anya, how can health professionals have more influence?
So I think one of the key things that Mary just mentioned is courage, and I think that's really important. But I think it's also worth emphasizing that there's lots of roles people can play, and that the organisations on this call today, you know, members of Parliament within Parliament, I know you're not one anymore, but, you know, that role, then people working kind of externally campaigning for change either by direct action or by campaigning externally, or the internal working in the NHS, they all need to work together, because if you're trying to make change within the NHS, that's easier if the outside context is all talking about change and climate change and what we need. I think the other thing I really wanted to mention is that what I've found mobilising various groups of people to work on this particular issue, and when I say groups, I really mean medical students and junior doctors and public health professionals, so all health people, is a lot of people really, really care about this. And actually, although they're very overworked and it's easy to kind of just blank it out entirely and not pay any attention, when given a way in, really want to do something that aligns with their values. And actually, that's a really good way of mobilizing people and tapping into them, because they're very keen to do something that they feel so strongly about and agree with. So it kind of compensates to an extent with this, that sometimes you go to work and feel a bit like it's a bit of a paradox because there's so much waste, and because you're maybe delivering care in a way that you don't feel is the most sustainable way to deliver it. So I'd say it's also about encouraging healthcare professionals to engage in this issue, because that is something that will allow you to live and work by your values. And there are just so many things in the NHS at the moment that don't allow you to do that to the same extent, I think. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, Anya. I mean, I think in the last 3 years, partly because of Greta, the school strike, and also because of Extinction Rebellion, things have really changed. That whereas we, the Alliance, had to go to colleges and say, this matters, you ought to be part of this, and they'd say, oh, well, we've got a lot of other things to think about, it's so expensive. Now we have people kind of queuing up to join. We've sort of reached the point where we've got to be part of doing something about this. So, Mike, can you give us some ideas?
My take-home message is not to break my leg because it'd be too painful to crutches. So I think there's a real. So you can look at the news. We're living in a pretty toxic environment, aren't we? And you can see almost in the news every day someone from the Conservative right or the Prime Minister, dismissing people like me as hair-shirted, lentil-eating, sandal-wearing. Don't matter. They're not real people. You can ignore those. And I wear sandals and I love lentils, but even so, I'm dismissed. The reality is, I think, is the health professionals, actually your expertise and your standing comes from the fact that you know about health more than anybody else out there. So whenever I've been on obviously I've been on numerous marches, I think it makes a real visible difference when you see doctors out there with white coats on, nurses out there in their uniform, and speaking from a professional perspective, because I think that's a lot more difficult to ignore than it is, a kind of troublemaker or their life kind of character. So I think that's actually really important. I think obviously doing what you can to try and clean up the NHS, make sure it's as sustainable as possible, but your political power, as Jojo said, as a citizen, is really, really important. And if you can stand with that, with your professional hat on, and advocate to people the health reasons why we need to take this climate and nature emergency seriously, that will land in a way that won't land if I stand up and say there's good health reasons why we need to take this emergency forward. So I'd implore you and champion you for doing that. I know you are doing that, and I think it really does make a difference.
Thanks a lot, Mike. That's very encouraging. So we're coming to the end now, and I've just got a few announcements that I want to make before we end. So the Intensive Care Society is currently recruiting into its environmental sustainability work group. So they encourage people to apply if you're a member of the Intensive Care Society, and you can go to the website and find out how to apply. There have been 4 previous webinars in this series, all of which are recorded and you can watch online, and I urge you to spread the word. I would say from our point of view, the UK Health Alliance, we have a webinar that we're repeating twice on Wednesday, on the 26th of October, where we've got, there are many different groups working in health and climate change, and we're going to hear from each of them together with one particular topic. So Anya will be talking about climate justice. And I think that could be useful to people who want to think, how can we get involved in this? Because as Anya was saying, there are many different ways to be involved. Lastly, I'd say that this has been recorded. We haven't had that many people here, but I think it's been a very rich discussion with lots of practical ideas. So I would urge you, when you get the link to the recording in a couple of days' time, to really extend it and reach it, make sure that lots of people can watch it, because I think there's really practical, useful stuff here. So let me end by thanking all of you for giving up your time to produce, I think, some rich ideas that will, I hope, have some influence, and perhaps see you all in Glasgow. Bye-bye.